I am a private detective working on the most complex and often classified cases. Many of them will never make it to the newspapers, and the people who help solve such crimes remain in the shadows. But there is one case I cannot forget, despite all my efforts. It was kept in a special folder, hidden away, so as not to revisit the memories of those monstrous events. Inside this folder was information about a series of murders that occurred in the late 80s in the suburban area of Moscow. From the very beginning of the investigation, it was clear that this was not an ordinary case. Back then, in the late 80s, the world was full of change. The country was undergoing a period of reforms, and among these changes, there seemed to be nothing that foreshadowed the horror that would soon descend on the local residents. But something hidden, something dark, began to emerge, causing everyone around to feel fear. Children were dying under horrific circumstances, and this went on for 6 long years. Every murder was carefully concealed, as if someone deliberately tried to erase all traces. It all began in 1986. That year, the country was on the rise. Mikhail Gorbachev, a series of reforms, but also the first shadows. The Chernobyl disaster, prohibition. At this time, brutal murders began in the Odintsovo district of the Moscow region. The first victim was 11-year-old Vanya Pavlov. He disappeared while going to ride a sled. His remains were found a few days later. The crime scene was so horrifying that even seasoned police officers could not contain their horror. Soon it became clear that these murders were not the work of a random maniac. The investigation quickly concluded that this was the work of a human, not an animal. The killer had dismemberment skills, and his victims were children. The crime scene was always carefully chosen, and all traces were erased so thoroughly that the investigation stalled from the very start. It was in this case that the system's weaknesses became evident, a hidden threat and hopelessness. A little while later, the next boy died, 14-year-old Andreyusha Gulyayev, who was into skiing. He was well known in his village, and his disappearance was a blow to his family. But here, just like with Vanya Pavlov, there were no traces that could lead to the killer. The police brought in all their forces, but the leads were catastrophically few. The only witness was a teenager who noticed a suspicious man with a tattoo saying, "Fisher." This seemed like an important clue, but the investigation hit a dead end when it turned out that the boy had made it all up for attention. Despite huge efforts, the search did not progress. Investigators encountered silence over and over. The town plunged into an atmosphere of anxiety, but success was elusive. Parents could not believe their children had just disappeared. They couldn't believe that such horror could happen in their neighborhood. After a while, the police discovered an old case of an attack on a teenager, in which the attacker had committed suicide by throwing himself under a train. However, upon checking, it turned out that this man was involved in an entirely different crime, an economic one. Thus, the real killer remained at large. Time passed, and the investigation yielded no results. Every time it seemed that the killer would soon be caught, a new clue led to a dead end. But everyone kept working. Something had to give results eventually. In 1992, 6 years after the series of murders began, the maniac made a fatal mistake. 3 teenagers on their way home hitched a ride, but one of them refused to get into the car, remembering the suspicious driver. This man turned out to be a local zoo technician, Sergey Golovkin. He was arrested, but unfortunately, there was not enough evidence to continue the investigation, and he was released. But his face could not be forgotten. Nevertheless, the investigators decided to carefully examine his life. He was a man with a dark past, but no one could suspect he was connected to such crimes. His path was hidden, just like his true face. When his property was searched, a torture room filled with implements of torture and evidence of his involvement in the murders was found. This discovery shocked not only the investigators, but the entire country. Golovkin confessed to his crimes, and the details of his atrocities shocked even the most experienced operatives. It seemed that this man was somehow connected to the foggy, hidden side of human nature that no one knew about. Soon he was sentenced to the death penalty. However, questions remain. How could such a person hide for so many years, and why did no one notice the signs of his horrifying double life? This case became not only one of the darkest chapters in history, but also a lesson about the importance of vigilance and not making mistakes in investigations. After Sergey Golovkin was arrested and confessed to his crimes, the investigation entered a new phase. Investigators began to carefully analyze his life, trying to understand how he had managed to hide for so long. They found many traces pointing to his hidden life that no one had suspected. As a child, he was quiet and inconspicuous. His parents lived on the outskirts of the Moscow region, and he left home early to study at a vocational agricultural school. However, as he grew older, he became increasingly reclusive. Working as a zoo technician, he spent more time with animals than with people. At first glance, his life seemed ordinary, but no one could know that his inner torment took terrifying forms, and he was capable of the most horrific acts. Consumed by his dark fantasies, Golovkin hid his true nature from everyone around him. He knew how to manipulate people and use their trust. His life was built on lies, and these lies continued until his victims started disappearing. Golovkin was always reserved, but at a certain point, he began to attract the attention of his colleagues. Those who were close to him could have sensed that something was wrong. However, all these signs were faint and could easily be ignored. Small, seemingly absurd things, like his strange, half-thought-out conversations about animals and their behavior, his fascination with blood and meat, all went unnoticed. But when he began to be suspected, he was already many steps ahead. He knew how to hide, and even when the police began investigating, he had already carefully planned every move to avoid responsibility. His secrecy became his curse. His attention to detail and ability to manipulate people allowed him to stay one step ahead of the investigation. He was also incredibly patient and knew how to wait for the right moment to strike again. When the truth about Golovkin's crimes finally came to light, it shocked society. No one could believe that such a quiet, invisible person could hide his true nature for so many years. This case became a topic of discussion in every household, and everyone asked the same question. How could it be that no one noticed how a terrible criminal walked among them, hiding in plain sight? Public services responsible for safety began to reassess their methods of operation. They realized that in such cases, not only the obvious facts matter, but also those hidden in the shadows. Psychologists and criminologists were forced to admit that there are people who not only know how to hide, but also act in a way that prevents them from being noticed. The fear that gripped the country gave rise to suspicion and mistrust. People began to look at each other with caution. But despite this, many began to ask themselves what might have helped to solve these crimes earlier. Why did all these victims die without having a chance to tell their stories? Why didn't those who could help notice the alarming signs earlier? This became a lesson for everyone. Never underestimate even the smallest signs. When Golovkin was sentenced to the death penalty, many felt a sense of relief. However, in the darkness, there remained a question that would not let them rest. Had his murders been completed? As it turned out, what seemed like the end of this terrifying story was actually just the beginning of a new threat. Soon after Golovkin's execution, new crimes began. This time, investigators could not link them to his activities, and the murders started to take on a new nature. This raised alarm. Perhaps, in the world, there was someone else who used the same methods and hid as skillfully as Golovkin. This thought led them to a terrifying conclusion. Perhaps the maniac was not alone. This revelation shook the country and revived the fear in societies that had already begun to forget the horrors of the 80s. Everyone understood that the crimes committed by Golovkin could only be part of a much darker and more complex picture. For the investigation, this meant a new challenge, and they needed to be prepared for the fact that the real nightmare was not over. Everything that happened after the crimes of Golovkin were uncovered became a lesson for everyone working in law enforcement. First and foremost, it was a reminder of how important it is not to forget the smallest signals. Even those who seem completely ordinary can hide terrifying secrets. Investigators understood that the most important aspect of their work was paying attention to the smallest and most invisible details. At this point, they began to reassess their investigative methods to ensure that no clue would be overlooked. In a world where evil hides behind the masks of ordinary people, every word, every glance can be the key to unraveling the most terrifying mystery.